Welcome to the podcast for Healing Neurology, where we talk about everything that can help heal your neurology, which is really everything, from food, lifestyle, and medicine to nature, culture, and politics. There's no topic too big or too small. I'm Jillian Ehrlich, family nurse practitioner, certified in Ayurveda and functional medicine. And we have with us here today Mr. Stefan Weitz. Stefan Weitz was initially trained as a physicist and ultimately spent nearly 2 decades at Microsoft, and in the interim, 14 years ago, was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis, MS. Despite trialing a number of pharmaceuticals and following conventional instructions, he continued to have symptoms not consistent with his expectation for what he wanted his life to look like and feel. He dove into learning about his diagnosis and potential treatments with the same curiosity and tenacity with which he'd already approached his life and career. Stefan noticed deep shifts with foundational changes in his, wait for it, not brain or nervous system, but with his gut, changes in his gut. He ultimately was able to ditch the daily fistfuls of pills, and with these changes in diet and gut support, and he started Jetson Health to share these insights. His mission is to intertwine the art and science of healing. He continually is evolving his probiotics, his prebiotics, and his children's products, and he uses them as the launching pad for discussing transformative medicine. We are thrilled to have you on the show today as an N of 1 for your experience and as a citizen scientist for your knowledge you've gained along the way. Welcome, Stefan. We're so glad to have you.
Wow, you pitched this better than I do. I should have you as our marketing team. It's great.
Good. I'm glad I hit it. So welcome.
Thanks.
Let's hear a little bit about your story. I think the N of 1 is really important because while we talk a lot about structures and systems and treatments, what it really comes home to is what happens for each person with their lives, with their symptoms, with their treatments, and with their changes. So let's hear a little bit about how your story went.
Yeah, well, I mean, you kind of captured a lot of it. Basically, I was a hard-charging, junior exec, if you will, at Microsoft. This is back now in must have been 2005-ish or so. And I was actually in Hawaii on a vacation with my then wife. And I woke up in the morning and I put my feet on the floor and my right leg was numb. And I could still walk, and I was totally fine, but I couldn't feel any pain. So, of course, my first thought was, I'm becoming a superhero, which was pretty awesome. And then my rational mind kicked in and realized it probably wasn't actually happening. But for a brief moment, I thought, I can't feel pain. This day just got awesome. Let's go solve some crimes. So I called my buddy, who's back then was at Mass Gen back at Harvard, and I said, hey, this is what's happening. And he said, okay, you need to get back on a plane, get to Seattle, go see a neurologist. I think something's going on. And so I did. Got back, and my primary care provider is Swedish, and Dr. Lisa Moore. And then she quickly said, oh, you need to go see Dr. Lily Jung, who's a neurologist here in Seattle. And I think it was the next day, in fact. I mean, to be clear, high privilege life here, right? I had exceptional care all the way through. Dr. Jung tested me that day, spinal tapped me, cultured it, called me the next night, at 9:00 at night and said, oh, congratulations, you got MS. And literally within a couple of days, had all the different drug options laid out for me and got me on a protocol really quickly. So that was great. Literally from initial symptom onset all the way, to being first line DMD or disease modifying drug was, maybe 9 days. So extraordinarily fast, which is, again, as we all know with MS, really lucky because people go for years being misdiagnosed, not listened to, not treated well. And those years can really have massive impacts on people's outcomes. So got on a traditional DMD, an interferon beta DMD. And for the first 7 years was just popping that. It was every 3 times a week, shooting myself in the stomach with a small needle of drugs that were cultured from the ovaries of Chinese hamsters. I don't know why they kept putting that in the box, but they did. A bizarre fun fact in the back. It's like, that's an odd fact having outside of a box, but okay, there you go.
Wow.
So did that for many, many years and definitely kept the disease at bay. I had no physical progression, no mental progression, nothing like that. But certainly did not feel good for years and years and years. Felt like I had the flu for 7 years running. And at the time, I had teams on 4 continents. I was on a plane probably, over half the time, traveling around the globe 60-some plus times. And it hurt every day. I didn't feel very good. And it's a result both of the MS clearly and also just the drugs, which that was a known side effect. And so I was speaking at a conference, it must have been in 2011, 2012 in that range. And I was either following or preceding Dr. Mark Hyman, who's, as you know, a big functional medicine doctor. And he and I were on the stage and got off the stage and started talking. And I said, hey, gosh, Dr. Hyman, I have this MS and it's really painful. And he goes, well, why don't you come out to my clinic back in Massachusetts, in Lenox, Massachusetts. Come on out. and we'll take a look at you. So I did. I flew out there, spent a couple of days out in Lenox, ran a couple hundred different tests on me, talked to the nutritionists and the dietitian and Dr. Hyman and a nurse practitioner, everyone, the whole team there basically came out with a protocol with the conclusion that your gut was out of whack. You had serious dysbiosis. And that was causing all sorts of problems, whether it's the permeability of the gut and things leaking out where they shouldn't be and causing a whole body inflammatory response. And that causes a lot of the pain. And I thought, okay, well, I mean, I'm a healthy guy. We'll see, right? Sure, doc. Let's go with this.
Had you had any bowel issues?
Not that I can remember, honestly. Nothing that was ever so distressing that I thought I had to do something about it. No, Not really. But he and his clinic and his team looked at a lot more than just the gut. They were looking at environmental toxins and what kind of body wash I was using and kind of how I did my clothes, what kind of dry cleaners I was using, all things like that. So really kind of a comprehensive panel, which was great. Bottom line is I cut out gluten, cut out dairy, cut out all refined sugars, cut out caffeine, briefly cut out alcohol, realized that wasn't going to work long term. So that didn't last long. But the reality was literally within 3 weeks from when I began that regimen, pain had gone away. And I was literally popping 2,000 milligrams of painkillers a day on a Tuesday. And 3 weeks later, which almost is too fast to believe, according to many doctors and people in the space, but it's true. I have the date in my calendar. I marked it, so I know very well when it was. And it was 3 weeks to the day that all the pain was gone. And I haven't touched those things since. And the disease has completely stopped. And in fact, the myelin, my kind of C5, C6 part of my spine has begun to repair. At least MRIs, it's becoming less and less white, which I'm not quite sure what's going on there, but everyone's happy. So it's a truly, for me, remarkable story as a guy who loves science and loves the scientific method and loves large sample sizes and properly controlled variables. You look at some of these things and you're like, how could that be really true? This doesn't make any sense. But once you get into the actual science and look at the history and look at broader studies than just the ones you see maybe on PubMed, it's pretty obvious what this is doing. So for me, again, N of one, but transformational, really focusing on the gut.
That's fantastic. I have to say that this is a story that is not infrequent in my practice. So
Sure.
3 weeks is what we typically talk about in terms of the gut turnover, the cells of the gut, so that in 3 weeks that's why you typically do an elimination diet for at least 1 month, is so that you can have 3 weeks plus a buffer to see kind of how things go. So when you make changes in the gut, it's true that you can actually sometimes get some pretty transformative impact in just weeks to month as opposed to months to years. It depends a lot on how deep the disease is. And although MS is pretty deep disease, and some people are more kind of stuck than others, but I do see not infrequently changes within 3 to 4 weeks. So fantastic.
Yeah. I guess I'm not interesting after all then.
Still a very interesting story because it actually did happen.
But I'm actually glad to hear that that's not unique, because I did for a while worry, like, am I just a weird one-off case? Is my particular microbiome set up in a way where it healed faster? It's really great for me to hear that 3 weeks is not uncommon, because that just means more people can actually get healthier faster than I thought, which is great.
It's hard to say that definitively because, it's sometimes the way that I generally think of it is at least 1 to 2 months to make the changes and see what happens, 6 months to be really focused on the gut, and then about 2 years to be vigilant. And then after about 2 years, if you've really had changes within that first 1 to 3 month period, and you haven't really had any other assaults or kind of new injuries to your health in those 2 years, usually you can build enough of a cushion after the 2 years to start relaxing your vigilance. And my goal
Wait. You're saying I can eat pizza right now? Is that what you're saying?
But the goal is that, if the queen invites you over for pizza, that you can actually have a few bites and it's not going to totally crump your system forever.
Well, early on, call it the first couple of years of this diet, if I did have an In-N-Out burger in California when I went down there, which again I had done, I would actually feel it pretty progressively. I could feel it the next day. Yeah. And now, because I've been clean for so long and my body, I think, is really kind of just adapted, even when I do have that occasional slice of Bracco's, which it is spectacular pizza, to be very clear, I didn't feel any different, which was great.
Good.
I was happy about that.
And that is what we want. And I think it gets confusing for people because they think, first of all, they come off a lot of foods and then they try to put them back in a month or two later and they're much more symptomatic. And they think, great, I just did this and now I feel really shitty every time I eat something. I think when you pull everything out and you feel better, then when you initially start putting them back in, the immune system is very reactive. The gut is leaky, or we call it increased intestinal permeability, so that the immune system is reacting to these foods. Your digestion isn't sharpened yet. You don't have that immune cushion, and that over time you are able to tolerate them. But the trick then is if you think, oh, I can do this, and start doing it all the time, your symptoms likely will return. And it often is once you've made the gains, if you lose them, they can be harder to remake. So
Interesting.
I think you're on a good track.
I feel great. 7+ years ago. So it's pretty easy to stay on it these days.
That's amazing. So it sounded like you weren't necessarily looking for other treatments when you saw Dr. Hyman. It was like he mentioned it to you, but you didn't come into this as a searcher.
No, honestly, I didn't. I came into this, look, I had, and I continue to have phenomenal care. Dr. Carolyn Taylor is my current neurologist since Dr. Jung left Seattle, went down to Atlanta, and now she's back. I have very high quality care that I really trusted because I didn't get sick, frankly, right? And it was really good. I didn't feel great, but I didn't get sicker. So no, I didn't have any real reason not to trust them. And I still, by the way, trust them. Absolutely. It was just this additional kind of insight after I saw Dr. Hyman's speech and talked to him for a while on how he was very, very sick and really just got into, he was an ER doc, wasn't a functional guy at all. And then he was very, very sick and then almost died, I think, actually, and overweight and unhealthy. And he pioneered his own kind of path and just transformed, And so hearing that story, I'm like, well, gosh. And he really pushes food as medicine, which is interesting. Honestly, I was not searching because I knew what the disease was. I knew the method of action for the disease. I could see that the drugs they were prescribing, I could look at all the data and understand kind of what was going to happen over the course of my life, with a decent confidence interval and not a massive variability band. And thought, well, I'm not going to mess with this, honestly. It wasn't until I talked to Doc and went out there and honestly thought, well, what have I got to lose? I'll stay on my DMDs, but I'll also do this. And wow, it was, again, transformational. So I wish I was more curious, honestly, because I wish I would have done it earlier on. But at the time, again, as a very Western trained guy, I looked at the data and looked at the outcome data and looked at the side effects data and thought, oh, okay, this is a pretty good shot. I wish I had known, like Dr. Terry Walls, for example, she hadn't really pioneered her treatment yet either for this back then. So if she had been around back then and talking about as much as she is now, which is great, probably would have been a different conversation. But, I'm a nerd and sometimes have good habits and bad habits. And one bad habit is that we kind of over rely on data and models. And so that's what happens.
Right. It's a healthy balance, just like with everything.
Yeah,
a healthy balance.
Exactly.
And so has investigating your illness in this way or having these treatments be effective, has this changed your perspective on health and healing?
Oh, yeah. I mean, how could it not? I mean, it's one thing to read about it, something else to feel it every single day. And that's what got us so inspired to start Jetson was, I had this kind of embarrassment of riches, right? I had access to this very famous doctor. I had the resources to fly out there and stay. I had phenomenal health insurance with Microsoft that paid for everything. And so I had kind of no restrictions on what I could go do. I could afford the food and I could, all that kind of stuff, right? Honestly, kind of grossly unfair. As I spent time on MS boards online across the nation or talked to newly diagnosed patients who were just terrified and scared, they were getting bad advice. They were getting, and they also didn't have access. And I thought, well, gosh, I have all this knowledge. I've been working on it now for years. I can still call Mark or I can call you or I can call these people. Not everyone in the world can. And I can ask questions and get smarter. I thought, why can't I just pay this forward? Because again, and we talked about this before too, there are, kind of three broad types of, not treatments, but three broad types of, I guess, treatments, you could say. There are ones that have just incontrovertible data, like you shouldn't be smoking, right? We know for a fact that smoking is bad. There's just no upside to smoking. Maybe there is somewhere, but I don't think there is. I'm sure RGR funded a great study showing smoking was good for something, but
it does actually release dopamine.
That is true. That is true.
So
but there's many ways to do that without getting a lung cancer too. So there are things that are kind of incontrovertible in their evidence and whatnot. Then there's the second kind of classification of things that are directionally accurate. Like we can see the data trending this way. I can't guarantee it's going to work. And of course you can't guarantee anything in medicine, but it looks like it's a pretty high likelihood of a positive outcome if you do X, Y, and Z. And there's the kind of third thing, which is we think it's going to work. Like there's enough kind of bubbling. It's below that second threshold, but it just makes sense that's probably like more water is going to be a good thing. Your body's mostly water. The digestion is predicated on water. Gut health needs water. So like having that is important. So it was getting into that kind of that notion of how can we take those three buckets and really boil it down to be something which is accessible and achievable by everybody, not just people who can afford to fly across the country and see a specialist? How can we take all that data and information, build a company which is focused on getting people healthier in simple, practical, achievable ways? And that's why I birthed Jetson. And that came directly because my perspective, frankly, totally shifted, from just relying on that first bucket of treatments, which have to be beyond a doubt efficacious, which even when saying that out loud sounds silly because nothing is beyond a doubt efficacious in medicine, as we all know, or in science for that matter, but more so than not, I guess. So yeah, absolutely changed fundamentally how I viewed health and treating disease.
And so how would you define health? What would your definition of health be?
I'm sure maybe it was even you or somebody I was talking to. They were talking about not lifespan, but health span, right? And I butchered that somehow. But in essence, I think people have always thought about longevity as that's the true measure of health. You live to be 110. The guys in the blue zones around the world and the ladies in the blue zones around the world, are they living to that? And sure, that's one measure. To me, it's that ability to be almost unrestricted from doing almost whatever you want. And
Yes.
for as long as you can, right? Yep. So I love the fact that I can run a 5K today and not blink about it, right? Because my body is tuned to the point, and I'm not that healthy, but my body is tuned to the point where I'm healthy enough to do that without having to train for 6 months. I love the fact that I can get in an airplane and ride out of New York tonight, and not tonight anymore, and 2 months ago, and hit a stage and deliver a speech and fly back that night and kind of power through and have that vitality, energy to keep that kind of pace up for a long time. So to me, it's about that, really the quality of what I can pack in a day and how am I able to do that and still be present for my daughter and be present for my wife and be present for my family and not destroy myself in the process. Having that optionality to kind of do whatever you want within, of course, many restrictions that we all have, but having that optionality truly to me is kind of like the definition of health.
And so what I'm hearing you saying, just putting my little Ayurvedic hat on, really we've got 4 aims in life. So we have our duty to do, and our duty is kind of what we're here to do. We have our material attainment, the engagement of our bodies with our environment, our homes and our places of work and our places of worship and the outdoors. And then there's the pleasure that comes from life. And then there's the liberation from all of those things. So attainment or the self-actualization that comes separate from anything that we perceive or do. But what I'm hearing you say is engagement, the freedom, the ability to engage fully with all of those tasks of life is really kind of what we could call health.
Yeah, you said it better than that. I mean, that's what I was trying to say, yes.
And so tell us a little bit about Jetson, about what you're doing with Jetson.
Sure. So when I looked at what I had done besides the diet adaptation that I performed, there's really 5 kind of common, or 5 easy things. 1, drinking a lot of water. 2, getting the right amount of sleep. 3, getting enough movement and exercise. I'm not a gym rat, but I certainly get out if I can every single day and get some cardio in and some weights. 4th, focusing on what I'm putting in my mouth. So a lot of leafy greens, a lot of nutrient-dense foods, dropping all the garbage that we see out there in the standard American diet. And then 5th, the gut, like getting my gut in shape. And of those 5 things, the first 4, not necessarily easy, but fairly easy, and most of them are achievable. Fresh food one can be tricky depending where you live, but everything else you can pretty much do on your own. The gut was hard. And when I was going through my regimen, trying to find that right probiotic was really hard. There are 450 plus brands in the market right now, many of which just use commodity strains that have no clinicals behind them. Many of them are sitting on a shelf for a year, which isn't good in most cases. And frankly, trying to determine, the brands are silly. They'll say vitality, immunity, and then just have these kind of broad-based claims that are really tough to get your head around. I'm a huge fan of a guy named Barry Schwartz, who was a professor at Swarthmore, who wrote a great book probably 15 plus years ago called The Paradox of Choice, which basically says, when human beings are presented with too many options, we generally don't make any choice because there's all these things that kick into our brains that cause us not to make one. So I said, what if I could just build an insanely high quality probiotic where we did all the research and we rotated it every quarter based on both what science was saying was efficacious and what the body actually needed. So you look at summertime, for example, people want to get outside, they want to be more active, they want to maybe drop a few pounds. What strains of bacteria can we find that'll help with those goals? And how do we create that pill just in time for summer? For fall, it's about mood and heavy food. For winter, it's about immune kind of support. And for spring, it's about being outside. Of course, this spring, that wasn't a great call, but that's a different conversation. But being outside and looking for like rhinitis and allergy response. Yeah. And so our whole idea was we'll create the world's first seasonal probiotic where we will literally reformulate every quarter based on, again, the most recent science and on what the bodies need at that time of the year. And so that's what we did. That's Jetson. You subscribe to it. It comes to your house every month, and we rotate the strains for you. So that's the idea. And
tell us a little bit about what you found in the research when you dove into the research, because the probiotic research out there is insane.
And that's the right word for it, circus. Just like at any other circus, there are acts you see that are like, wow, that is just pure skill and beauty. And other acts you see which are like, that's just a clown popping a balloon. It's just kind of garbage, right? No offense to our clown listeners. But that's what I found in this space. space, right? And if you look at the research, 1995, I think there were a grand total of, I don't know, like 38 studies that mentioned the gut microbiome and the probiotics and whatnot. And then literally in 2020, I think we're going to have almost 4,000 studies on the same topic that are published to PubMed and stored at NIH. So the amount of research is just voluminous. But what struck me, once you got past the varying quality, and some are done by companies that are having a certain agenda, and some are just super small sample sizes, and some have really poor construction of design. And so you have to wade through all that stuff.
Yeah.
And what you're left with at the end is still very interesting, because people have thought for years, thanks to Jamie Lee Curtis, that probiotics are basically for pooping, which sure, they will likely help with your bowel movements. Absolutely. But again, the research has been showing over the last really 7 or 8 years, and probably longer, you know better than I do, what probiotics can do for broad health in general are spectacular. I mean, there are great clinicals that we have in our immunity product that show a more supportive immune system, a more active immune system, not boosted, because you can't really boost your immune system per se, but a healthier immune system. There are strains that support things like eczema. There are strains that support things like mental health and psychobiotics. And so what I found was in the research, just the number of conditions, of disease states and disease conditions that can be affected by probiotics and the application thereof in the human body were astounding. And that was kind of me, the aha. Like, making another poop pill, fine, we can do that. But I don't want to wake up in the morning every day and just think about poop pills.
I mean, I think it's one of the most satisfying things that we do as human beings. I think it's totally
100%.
underrated. Every job I have had in my life, going from starting with outdoor educator, I've pretty much talked about poop the whole time.
There's certainly the thing I hear most of all, and I get some pretty interesting fan mail, and I get some pretty graphic fan mail too. But certainly the first cohort of customers so our customers stay for a long time. Like our average, we're only about 10 months old, and our first cohorts, I think the average tenure is 6.7 months or so. So people will stick around for a while, which is good to see. And of that first cohort especially, I got a lot of folks mailing me just saying, I've had the best poop of my life. And I'm like, great, but how else do you feel? But those two are oftentimes linked. One of our customers, he's an old sports broadcaster from Chicago, and he's in his 80s, and he has lost all his friends. They've all died, and he's a phenomenal guy. And he was just kind of bummed out and depressed, and really had challenges with mobility, and frankly, challenges with bowel movements. And that was really causing massive real life problems for him. Yeah. And so he got on a program, now probably 8-9 months ago. And he's now my biggest advocate. He literally, it's changed his life. I mean, I want to believe these work, because I take them every day, obviously, and I want to believe they're that good. And I think they are honestly that good. But you also, at the back of your head, especially as a Western trained guy, think, could this be it? Could he have gotten healthier a decade ago by taking my dumb little pill? And you just kind of bummed out that you're delighted, and also kind of like, man, oh man, it's just that simple.
So I'll say that, I think in many ways it is that simple. And what I hear in your story is that you had so much access and capacity to look into this, to look into what's going on with your health. And that's what you're essentially trying to do as you share Jetson. I mean, that is what you're trying to do, is make your learnings more accessible to everybody else.
That is it.
Yeah.
And we've been preaching since the launch of the company. Like, we're not a probiotics company, we're a health company. And we are just focused on, again, it's those 5 things, 4 of which, frankly, you don't need me to do anything for, like sleep, move around, drink water, and eat grains. Like, you don't need me for that, right? But if I can just tell you what to do and help you see how, frankly, again, it takes commitment, and there's some sacrifice, no question, nothing's free. But if you do those 5 things, you're going to be 85% healthier than you are today. And it's shocking how little it actually takes.
So it's interesting. I don't know, have you ever seen the movie Fat, Sick, and Nearly Dead?
Totally, yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the things that I love about that movie, besides the fact that I cried, I just thought it was so sweet, the changes that the second gentleman, the trucker in the film, underwent.
Yep.
And how people come into our lives and send us in directions that we had no idea we were meant to go, but certainly we were meant to go there. The thing that I really found meaningful about watching that movie was the first gentleman in the film who made the film going around to all these different places and talking to all these different people about changing their diet, and how many people just said over and over and over again, I could never do that. I could never do that. I could never do that. And after a while, you start realizing that that is a program, that is a tape we play over and over in our mind, that we can't do something, that we're bound by something, that we have developed a pattern that doesn't really allow us to change, but that really we do have the neuroplasticity as well as the power over our behavior to change whatever we do any day.
There has to be a carrot to an extent, right? And people have to consider and weigh carefully the discomfort one may feel in making a modification like that, albeit temporary, does that outweigh the discomfort they feel every day by their current condition? And human beings, we're just not good at that kind of forward projection.
It's really interesting. We the last podcast we did with Dr. Dan Krashen, who is quadruple board certified in pain, addiction, headache, and he's a psychiatrist. And it's one of the conversations, it's one of the topics we dived into fairly deeply, was the difference between our perception of now and our perception of later. And how when we think ahead, we generally make better choices for ourselves, but then in the moment, we throw that all out the window. And the study he cited that was so fascinating was college kids who were recruited to learn 2 sets of numbers. And while they thought what their challenge was to learn the numbers, what they were actually, the researchers were actually checking was what they would choose as their snack. And they were offered an apple or a piece of chocolate cake. And what he found was that the group who was only tasked with remembering 3 to 4 numbers at a time would typically choose the apple. And the group that was tasked with remembering 7 to 8 numbers would choose the cake. So it doesn't actually take much for us to say, forget it, I can't do it, I need help, and go after something. Study. It's really what we can do. The benefits can be fairly remarkable if we're able to stick to it. And that is one of the things that we can do in community. We actually can borrow each other's frontal lobes. We co-regulate as humans. And so the way that you're talking about building Jetson as a community for health is one way that we can help to co-regulate each other with our behaviors.
I hope so, because it's otherwise, as we discussed, there's a lot of easier ways to make a living than building a health company.
Yes. And I will say also that, although you may think that people don't need you for the first 4, for the water, the exercise, the sleep, and the greens, I have to beg to differ on that. I think that we all need hand-holding, even when it comes to drinking water and sleep. I mean, that's why we have apps where we can track our water drinking by watering a plant every time you record the water that you're drinking, or people put a rubber band around their water bottle and they move it up and down based on how much water that they've had. Every time you finish a liter, you get to move the rubber band down a click so you can see how many liters you're drinking in a day.
For Christmas, I got both ladies in my life. I mean, I'm probably the worst Christmas gift giver ever because I tend to do things that I think will be helpful versus what they actually want. But so they both got these really cool water. That's just cheap, inexpensive, high quality, but not like pricey water bottles from Amazon that are just literally a bottle, just like they have, I think, 10 bands on them. And when you finish the bottle, you just roll the band up to the top and you can see very easily. So it's a visual reminder. Oh, I've had 4 bottles today. And they both use them now, and their water consumption has gone up. They both feel better. It's like, I know. It's very simple stuff. That's what people get really confused and they get overwhelmed, understandably, because there's so much just frankly garbage out there on the web and so many BS diets and so many stupid, unnecessarily expensive hacks. I mean, it's not that complicated, frankly, to just go and do half this stuff. And that's a good example. Even forget the bottle on Amazon, just to your point, get a water bottle and put an elastic band on there and just put it up and down. That can work too. But that very easy reminder, that kind of easy visualization is what humans need to feel reinforced they can take the next step.
So I would say piece 1 is the knowledge. Piece 2 is also, if you have some connection, then change becomes easier. So for a long time, I used to recommend to people to get a water bottle that they loved or put stickers on it. Or when I was an Outward Bound instructor, I used to had a clear water, but I had an old plastic water bottle, and I had taped a webbing on it. So it had like a little handle. And then I had a beach rock from one of my favorite beaches in the San Juan Islands that I kept in the bottom of this water bottle. I had shoved it in there, and then it didn't typically come out. And it didn't really hit my face or anything when I drank, so it was convenient. But every time I looked at my water bottle, I felt like this love and appreciation for this time that I had spent in that place where I had gotten that rock, and I could see it. And so I had that water bottle for years because it was something that I felt like my friend, and that helped me.
It's like Wilson and Castaway. Exactly.
Yes, I know. Which is, I'm hearing a lot of reports from patients and friends with their young ones, befriending the picture of the baby on the diaper, on the diaper bag, or 3 soda cans that another patient's 7-year-old is dragging around the house and introducing to Lego. It's very challenging. We are in a challenging time, which makes it all the more meaningful and relevant that we keep our minds clear so we can make good decisions, which means if we're going to have clear minds, we have to have healthy bodies to the best of our ability, which means that we really do have to pay attention to all of these components, the drinking of water, the exercise and movement, even if it's inside your house with a YouTube video or whatever, with the eating of greens as possible. and sleep
Yeah.
and maintaining a daily routine.
Yes.
These are tougher than we think. And I will say that Ayurveda has good suggestions. As a 10,000-year-old healthcare system, Ayurveda has good suggestions. So this will be part of, what's coming out in our clinic and part of the material coming out of Jetson Health. So I want to go back a little bit to the science of the probiotics, because I
Sure.
think that is something that you have a particular body of knowledge about that our listeners are interested in. And I'm curious what your findings are. Like, what's the latest science that you've been reading about that you've been really into?
I think the thing that's getting me most excited these days is the burgeoning field of psychobiotics. It really the condition of the gut on the brain. And so a lot of your listeners probably have heard of the vagus nerve and understand the connection between the gut and the brain, and how at its simplest and probably least scientifically accurate, it's the feeling you get when you see your childhood sweetheart or something across the room, or the love of your life. You see that person and then you feel it in your stomach and your gut, and it's that connection of the two and how those co-regulate so interestingly. There hasn't been a lot of great studies on strains that have material impacts on the mood, basically on mood function, serotonin development and everything else. But in the last few years, there has been a few. And so I'm pretty excited, actually. We just landed a deal with one of the manufacturers of two strains that do actually have really good, solid human clinicals. And we're going to use those in one of our next products. But that's one I think is interesting. We have another company that we just started, actually, which is focused on helping folks overcome the symptoms of PTS, post-traumatic stress. I know enough to be dangerous here about what causes that and what triggers are. And what I've really dug into with that company is understanding the current treatment options. And they're just not very good. And no offense to any psychiatrists or psychologists out there, because you work the tools you're given, but the treatment modalities, they can be very effective, but there's a lot of failures too. And kind of the chronic drugging of people with kind of blunt force instruments. I think even any psychiatrist would agree that what they have to work with right now, it's not well understood and there's a lot of side effects. It's what we have to work with right now. Talk therapy, EMDR, these things are all, again, they can have real impacts, but they also can have a lot of failures. And so that's what I'm really excited about is how we can continue to look at the gut-brain connection and really create some positive mental outcomes for people, especially, not to kind of tap too much into COVID mania, but we are going to see a lot of mental health issues. We already are seeing them right now, frankly, because this is not going away anytime soon. That's something we should all get our head around. And so how do you kind of shift into that next phase of coping with this, not becoming consumed by it? So that's an interesting one.
When you started working on your gut with your MS, did you notice changes in your mind or your mood?
It's funny. I did not think about it until recently. So when I was first diagnosed with MS, I had all sorts of pills I was on and drugs I was on, and I kind of titrated off of a lot of them as I kind of would ask questions and get more specific. But one thing I found after being diagnosed was a pretty significant, I don't think you call it clinical, but a pretty deep depression. And it was really hard. I went to my doc, I went to my psychiatrist, and Dr. Jung actually said, "You're a smart kid. You keep thinking you can think your way out of this. That isn't the way that this works right now. Like, something's happened physiologically in you. You're not going to be able to think your way out of this, right?" So I went on gabapentin or something like that, some kind of broad spectrum pain med, I think, that was supposed to have some kind of psychological effects. Anyway, so I did that for a while. I can reframe my thinking. But you're right. Once I actually did switch my diet and focus on my gut, I never really thought about that again. So it's interesting you bring that up. I guess I'm just too happy now.
I mean, it's interesting to think about because, we're not supposed to perseverate on what hurts.
Right.
Once things feel fine, you just kind of move on with your life.
Right.
And it seems like that's what you have done.
So I'm like, oh, yeah, so that's behind me. On to the next thing.
Done with that. Yep.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
The other signs I was talking about was immune support. Again, we know that the majority of our immune system lives or is impacted by our guts. And so having a dysbiotic gut or out of balance gut, it has dramatic impacts on how your body responds to threats. And so that's not necessarily even new science, but we are now beginning to see a bunch of at least registered trials coming out now with different strains that do have good support for them to really, again, reinforce that gut barrier, make sure the communication between your gut and the rest of the immune responses in the body are healthy. They're getting messages out appropriately. The gut's where you see a lot of these things first, right? That's where a lot of these things kind of get into, and your body goes, "What is that?" And then it can communicate out to the broader immune system to go start making those killer cells to go take care of the bad guys. So yeah, and there's a bunch more, but those are ones, especially in our current age of COVID, that I think about a lot.
Absolutely. We definitely underestimate the power that our gut has on the rest of our entire system. it has its own branch of the nervous system, the enteric nervous system. So it's not only the vagus nerve, the 10th cranial, which is the 10th cranial nerve, but the enteric nervous system is really outside of the peripheral system and the central system. It has its whole own branch of perceiving. And even in utero, we see some connections between the gastrointestinal tract, the perceptions, and the central nervous system of very, very young children. Let me ask you this. Why be so vigilant with science? We know that it can be faulty. We know that you can kind of find any science to support almost anything you really want people to believe. Yeah. And how do you balance science and intuition in making choices for your own treatment and for kind of how you make your probiotics?
That's a really great question. There's, lies, damn lies, and statistics is the great tagline, right? From the old days. You can kind of make science whatever you want to say. So to me, when I look at a study or when I talk to a scientist, or I was speaking with our RP Eddie last night, who's a kind of a guy who does a lot of modeling around kind of Cassandra type events like Corona. And you really, to me, when I'm looking at science, I'm looking at a number of things, right? I'm looking at the quality of the construction of the experiment. I'm looking at who the person who's conducting it is and looking at their previous science to understand kind of motivations and inherent biases they have. I'm looking at not just the construction, but also kind of the scope of the project. How many things they're measuring, how many people are in the study. And then you kind of look at the quality of the results and look at the p-values and all the rest of the values of that to understand really kind of what it says, but never then reading the abstract or reading just a summary and saying, therefore, the CNN version of the study, this cures cancer. It's like, okay, let's dig in really what it actually does. And what you generally find in well-constructed studies is a very healthy balance of outcome data that has a decently sized error band, frankly, because the human body is so non-deterministic in many cases, right? And so that's my first step is I look at what I consider, the quality of that research and understand, can I believe the data and can I draw my own conclusions from that data independent of what the researcher, what he or she made as the headline. That's how I really get into it. At the end of the day, we have nothing else. I mean, the scientific method is still the best way, frankly, to test something. So why so vigilant? Because there's really no other option, especially you get into things like machine learning, which I spent so many years on as well. There things can go wildly wrong, right? And machine learning, I think the good example, years ago, for some reason, Netflix really thought I enjoyed gay movies. And so I would get a ton of just constantly promoted movies at me in that sense. And if I'm fine with them, I just don't really watch them that often. So it was one of those kind of weird things. Something triggered my behavior where they correlated me with another audience and began to recommend movies to me that I like. And so there's an example of why good science, bad model, faulty results. And so having that kind of understanding of the limitations of science, I think is one of the key things that people don't have today in this country or around the world. Even the models we're seeing now with COVID, if you look at the error bands in those things, they're massive. Yeah. If you look at the initial model that we were presented to us, and I looked at now probably 20 different models for COVID across the planet, almost all of them radically overestimated the curve. They thought we'd be a much worse place than we are today. And there's lots of reasons for that, but one of the initial reasons is simply that we didn't understand the initial conditions, right? Initial conditions are so important in science. So I'm kind of on a tangent, but my point is we know it can be faulty. So having a respect for how much you can really read into a scientific study is, I think, extraordinarily important, and we don't teach that enough in this country. Yes. So how do I balance science? I think I kind of just mentioned that, right? So I analyze what I think is the veracity of the topic. I respect the fact that there's still a bunch of stuff we don't know, and there are a bunch of variables we couldn't control for, and a bunch of things we couldn't test for, and a bunch of, frankly, chaos theory elements that pop around all the time and can cause the smallest little silly thing, the initial condition can cause a massive change in the end. So when I'm looking at that for my own health, it is that kind of recognition of maybe I can be 90% confident, maybe even 85% confident, and if I do X, Y will happen. My biggest pet peeve on the planet is binary thinking, because there's no such thing as a black and white in this planet. And so I always reserve 15% at least of any decision or any kind of processing that I'm doing to account for that which I don't know. That's my life. I do that. And then even in like the company that we're running in Jetson, same thing. Like if you look at our products, all of them have studied strains. So they're all studied, they have science behind them. But there are also ones that I put in there which have studies that are just okay, right? They're not as strong as I want them. I like the researcher. I like this design. I thought it was a good piece of, even though it wasn't totally conclusive, I'm like, I feel good about this, right? There's enough, it passed enough for me to really kind of believe. And again, as long as it's not going to do any harm or promise something that it can't possibly deliver, that's kind of how I tend to operate. If I can take a flyer based on a good understanding and a healthy skepticism of these absolutes, it's worth in that case, it's not really a risk. The only risk is you take something you don't need, but truly there's not much of a risk there. And so it's worth it to me. That's how I kind of balance it all.
That's great. And on your board, on your council, you have kind of a variety of influences already.
We do. We're so lucky. I mean, really, we're so lucky to have access to so many different people. And I can make a phone call and people, they hear it, they believe it, they understand this is more than a business. They understand this is something which I fundamentally believe can change millions of people's lives. And so, yeah, it's not just about having one specific. I could easily get a board full of, gastroenterologists, MDs, and that would be it, right? And honestly, I interviewed a lot of those folks and I talked to a lot of those folks, and they're phenomenal people. And they view things like probiotics in a very narrow band. And they will say, yeah, I will prescribe probiotics for Crohn's and IBS, right? Those are the two things that I think are super important for probiotics. And I say, well, have you seen this research on, mental state, or this research on immune response, or this research on baldness or whatever? I don't know about that. That's not my thing, right? And so again, thank goodness people actually are deep in their subject area and stay in their lane sometimes, unlike other people who just talk about everything. But I found that pursuing those very particular kind of specialties I think we would not have as rich a company as we have, because we are open and passionate about really doing more than just popping a pill. I want to make this into a lifestyle company that helps people, again, break through these habits and establish these habits more accurately, that will ultimately help them get better.
That's fantastic. It is really fun. I've never been good at staying in my lane, I'll be honest.
By the way, either am I. I have like 5 companies and they're all the different things. I love learning so much, which is why what I do is so much fun, because I get to do so many different things. But I do appreciate people actually. You want those people in those positions because you do want folks who have depth of thought and quality of thought and are passionate about their particular, mitochondria. You want that, right?
Yes. It's interesting. There's thinking about sources of knowledge. Ayurveda actually has a lot of sutras, which are their mnemonics for remembering about where do you find your sources of knowledge. And Ayurveda itself is a science that was said to have been divined by rishis, rishi meaning seer. So people who were sat deep in the forest and essentially meditated on the nature of humanity and what humans needed, what life was. And that's where the original elements of Ayurveda came from. The original principles of Ayurveda were insights from meditation.
Huh, interesting.
So when you look at what science is telling you now, all these thousands of years later, it's fascinating. So for instance, from the ancient Ayurveda, divined in meditation, it was that red blood cells lived 108 days. Now we see red blood cells live an average of 120 days. That's what's proved by science. The 108 was divined by meditation. And so a lot of those, when we think about sources of knowledge, it really does depend on our mental clarity. And I think you've hit a lot of it in terms of looking at articles, partially by the method, the research method, part of it by the study and the study materials, and then part of it by the researcher or the approach to the question. Because posing the right question changes a lot the type of answer that you get.
Absolutely.
So research can be pretty fascinating. One of my favorite fun facts about probiotics is in talking about the microbiome over the whole of the human body. We've got organisms not only in our gut, but in our ears, in our armpits, in our...
Right, everywhere.
But when we look at our genes, when we look at the number of protein encoding genes that we have in the human genome, we really only have about 20,000 protein encoding genes in the human genome, which is about the same number as a nematode, right?
Yeah.
A grain of rice has about 70. But when we include the number of genes in the microorganisms that live in us and on us, we number in the hundreds of thousands. Our complexity really is rooted in our symbiosis.
We are more bacterial than human, I think is the one of the catchphrases, right?
We are very much. And so the question is always like, who's the parasite on who? Because there's more of them than there are of us.
I think Mr. Lactobacillus LA14 would say it's definitely us for the parasite. But
That's such a fun way to think about these probiotics as personalities. Do you have?
Oh, I do. I had the marketing team one day. I was like, hey guys, I want to kind of anthropomorphize the various strains, And so
Yes.
for a while we had like BL14, which is interesting. If you look at him under a scope, he's pretty chunky. So he's like this jovial, chunky bacterial strain. I'm not sure why I always want to turn into jovial, chunky ones, but I just do. They just seem like people you want to hang out with. That's one. I think BIO6, which is another interesting one. That was in our immune function or support, I believe. And that one, of course, was dressed as a doctor. And I have to look at all the ones we have, but we did anthropomorphize these things. We kind of ran it as a marketing thing, and no one really thought it was very funny. So it was one of my ideas that went nowhere that I thought was clever, but people are like, they don't want to think about eating a chunky Italian man. That just doesn't make any sense to them. So I thought it was funny, but apparently that's why they keep me out of the marketing meetings.
Oh God, I love it. It's kind of like, who's your spirit microorganism?
Exactly, right? But like nobody really wants to talk about bacteria, honestly. It's like one of those things that, I mean, I do, but if you're talking about, the Kardashians' pool house or, bifidum.
There's a great old book of Sufi stories that I have. I think it was published in the 40s. And one of the stories, I just found it was fascinating that it was there. But one of the stories is basically the king, the rich, wealthy king, talking about how, there was nothing more important in life than wine and women. And the Sufi advisor said, really, king? Are you sure? Nothing better? And the king would say, nope, nothing's better. It's only wine and women. And so the advisor slipped some laxative into his wine. And so that night, as he's drinking wine and enjoying women dancing, he's saying, oh, I just pause everything. I just got to get up. And the advisor was saying, why would you ever leave? There's nothing better than wine and women. Everything that's the best in life is right here. And he said, no, I got to go. And the advisor said, no, seriously, everything you've said, wine and women, it's right here, right now. And ultimately, the king said, okay, I admit it. There is one thing better than wine and women, and I have to go to the bathroom. I got to get out of here for a second. So I do think that we underestimate how happy it makes us. And I don't know why we don't talk about it more. I guess it's because it's, waste elimination is part of the trash of the body, and it's pretty gross and everybody's embarrassed. In fact, I have one person in my life who shall remain unnamed, but she says, when she was a kid, she felt like the really cute girls probably didn't poop. And so she thought they were too cute to poop, and she was not cute enough to not poop.
To not poop. I don't know. There's something, and this is just, there's something about that. I think that's probably not an uncommon feeling. Like I don't ever want to imagine, like Giselle, Tom Brady's wife, pooping. That's just me. I mean, it's awful and shallow for me to say, but I guarantee it. You don't maintain that figure without pooping. But
it's got to go somewhere.
It's got to go somewhere, unless she doesn't eat. Like maybe she's an android. Who knows? But
poor Giselle. It's true.
I have no idea. I know, but you're right. I understand. And we struggle a lot. We actually, created a bunch of creative assets when we launched our kids probiotic. One was called Poop Troop, which is a really cute video that we put together, or actually this team in California put together. Just really, really funny. She's a phenomenal writer. So funny. Hasn't got the traction it deserves, I don't think, just because I think, again, it's one of those taboo topics that people don't want to talk about. Even though it's funny to say, just no one wants to talk about it. So
if people want to see that, how can
they? Yeah, I mean, just go to YouTube and look. Jetty Poop Troop is there indeed on YouTube.
I have a lot of patients that come in that don't know what a normal poop is. And so the way I describe it is 1 to 3 times a day, soft and form like a banana. So I had a patient come in once who said, oh my God, I don't poop more than twice a month. Why would anyone do that?
What?
Yeah. And I said, are you kidding? And he said, it's very uncomfortable. I said, that's what happens when you only go twice a month.
He must eat the strangest diet and have the most hyper sophisticated digestion system on the planet that doesn't have any waste. That's bonkers. What was he eating?
Well, I know. Well, it was very uncomfortable. And I think a lot of times what happens for kids, if they're not eating enough fiber, or if it's uncomfortable, or if, to go back to the nervous system involvement, if our sympathetic system is in action, if we're trying to run from the lion, it's not the time to eliminate waste. And so if you feel panicked as a kid because your environment isn't safe, then often the bowels stop.
Yeah.
Often if kids live like that, then it can develop into a chronic constipation, and that's not unusual. And I see a lot of chronic constipation. So we're working on kind of reversing that. And there is online, you can see the Bristol stool scale.
Yep.
I should get commission from them for how many times I recommend looking that up. But that can give people a sense of, what are the options and what means what.
If you're listening to this in the morning, I would avoid looking at it this morning, but at some point, just be aware of what you're about to see. That's all you should know. But it's important.
You should, yes, absolutely.
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about prebiotics. We've talked about probiotics being the organisms. Tell us about prebiotics and the science behind those.
Well, prebiotics are actually really simple. They have a very complex name, but in actuality, all they are basically things that feed the good bacteria. So they feed the probiotics. And really kind of the best form of prebiotic you can really get after, and you may have an opinion on this too, but my opinion is just a great quality fiber. The problem, of course, in America, we just eat way too little fiber. I think is the recommended allowance, like 25 grams a day, I think is the kind of minimum, I think, allowance you want.
Between 25 and 40.
And 40. Okay, so 25 is the lower bound. And I think most Americans don't even come close to 25, not even close. So if you have enough fiber, you're probably getting a good chunk of your prebiotics anyway to feed the good bugs, but most of us don't. So we launched one with Jetson. It's called Gut Prep, and it's a really kind of interesting, novel prebiotic. It's not a yeast-based, not a fiber-based. It's a bacteriophage, and it's very effective at kind of helping the good stuff to grow. And clinically, actually studied to tamp down the bad stuff like E. coli and Salmonella. So the whole idea when we built that product was to kind of prep your gut. We assumed a lot of folks wouldn't have great guts to begin with. And so getting in there and kind of weeding it before you feed it, if you think about it that way, that was the idea behind that. But really important thing to get. A lot of folks don't get enough. And so you can end up with imbalances in the gut of too many bad bacteria, not enough good bacteria, and really a good prebiotic can help balance that out for you. And just such an unsung hero of the gut, frankly.
Great.
I know it's super hard. I mean, I had a health event that required me to make modifications to my life. And so that's why, and I'm a German. And so that means I respond to rules very well. When I got this diagnosis and then got this treatment plan, it was just like, I'm going to go do it. And I literally stopped overnight. I just one day quit everything and I quit caffeine, everything, just stopped and then never looked back. I know that's hard and not realistic for a lot of people for a lot of reasons. Every couple of weeks I check in with a couple of people that kind of coach along this journey. They're trying to get healthier, and both of them are trying to drop some weight and just learn healthier habits. And one, we've built a great support system, and she is having a great time. She wanted to drop 35 pounds, and she's hit that number since January 1st. Super healthy weight loss, super stable weight loss. It's great. She's running her 10K again. And the other one is not. She said she's struggling. And it's the same kind of coaching, same kind of method, and just two very different outcomes. And it's not because one's better than the other. It's just like life gets in the way. So I know it can be challenging, discouraging to make any change, even small ones, and fail. And my only suggestion is just to get back on the damn horse. Like you are going to screw up. You're going to go for a bender one night and have the whole bottle of Chablis. It's going to happen. It doesn't mean the entire thing is for naught. But giving yourself permission to fail and knowing that it's going to take a few times to get this right. I was just stubborn and German. So it's easier for me to hold to a rigid protocol. But that's not the case for everybody. And that's okay. And I think people need to have that permission to know that you're going to have ups and downs before you hit the straight and narrow.
Great. Well, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thanks for having me.
And so Jetson Health, we are Jetson. I didn't mention this earlier, but we are Jetson, JETSON.com. That's where people can find you, more about you and your products. So thank you for listening today with Stefan Weitz. We've got lots of ways to continue this conversation through Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. You can get more information from and about us at our website, centerforhealingneurology.com, or even better, come see us in person at our Seattle clinic. We are open for visits. Please be sure to share this show with your friends, and we welcome your rating and review wherever you get your podcasts. And please feel free to send topic requests to podcast@centerforhealingneurology.com. We love that you've joined us today to discuss how to make your whole world medicine. We rise or fall together and are committed to doing what we can to make as many of us as healthy as possible. And this takes all of us, including you. Thank you for listening, and see you next time.
Partyfish Media.
Partyfish Media acknowledges that it operates and records on indigenous Duwamish and Puget Sound Coast Salish land that is still home to the Duwamish tribe. This land is stolen in violation of the Point Elliott Treaty of 1855. We are committed to uplifting the name of these lands and community members from these nations who reside alongside us. For more information on this land, its people, or ways you can help, visit duwamishtribe.org or realrentduwamish.org.